Number 5. The Manson Family. Starting out with the most famous of the cults on this list, we have the group of young people who fell under the spell of Charles Manson in the late 1960s in California, USA. Charles Manson was in and out of prison for most of his life before settling in San Francisco and beginning to establish himself as a guru during the height of the Summer of Love hippie culture. Using some elements from the philosophy of the Process Church of Final Judgment, who believed that at the end of the world, Jesus and Satan would join forces to judge humanity, Manson formed a group of mostly young women, teaching them that they were reincarnations of the original Christians, and that he was Jesus Christ. In a converted school bus, the group made their way to Los Angeles, where Manson preached and continued to grow his group of followers. They stayed in the home of Dennis Wilson, of the Beach Boys, for a time, before eventually moving them to an old disused Western movie set, Spawn Ranch. In exchange for the company of the many female followers, the owner of the ranch, George Spawn, allowed Manson and his growing family to stay at the ranch free of charge. Manson began using his followers for extortion, taking a music teacher who they believed had inherited a large fortune hostage in his home and demanding that he join the cult and turn over the money. The man maintained that they were mistaken, and Manson attacked him with a sword before having one of his followers finish the job. In the cult's most famous incident, Manson sent 4 family members to the home of Hollywood actress Sharon Tate with instructions for them to end the lives of Tate and her 4 guests who were staying with her. The next night, these family members were joined by 3 others and brought by Manson to the home of Leno and Rosemary LaBianca, where they broke in and tied up the 2 residents at Manson's instructions. He then ordered them to dispatch the victims and left. Although it hasn't been conclusively proven, the Manson family are believed to be responsible for at least 15 other people, with Manson himself claiming at one point that he was responsible for 35 total deaths. Manson was apprehended and put on trial along with the family members who had carried out his orders, but the trial showed just what a hold Manson still had over his family. Family members showed up outside the courthouse where they held a vigil while armed with hunting knives. They threatened witnesses, setting fire to one man's van while he was still inside it. The trial itself was also a wild time, with one of the defense attorneys who Manson disagreed with going missing and being discovered murdered, and Manson at one point leaping over a table to try and attack the judge while the other defendants began chanting in Latin. Manson and the murderous family members were sent to prison in 1971. Manson remained in prison until his death in 2017. Number 4. Om Shinrikyo. This Japanese doomsday cult started out as a simple yoga and meditation class, which was founded by Shoko Asahara, using his bizarre interpretations of various forms of Buddhism, Hinduism, Christianity, yoga, and the works of Nostradamus. In 1992, Shoko published a book that claimed that he was not only Christ, but Japan's only enlightened master. He claimed that he had the ability to take away the sins and bad deeds of his followers and transfer spiritual power to them. As is the case in a lot of cults, he claimed that doomsday was fast approaching and that everyone except his followers would be killed. The movement grew, eventually getting enough members to be considered an official religion. Membership continued to grow, but rumblings began emerging that some members were being tricked into joining, were being forced to donate large sums of money, being held against their will, and in one case even murdered when they tried to leave. An anti-cult lawyer tried to sue the group and soon went missing with his wife and child. Things escalated even further in 1993 when the group tried to use a machine to pump anthrax onto a neighborhood in Tokyo. Although thankfully, the group had stolen the wrong type of anthrax and no one was hurt. Due to the failure of the anthrax, the group began manufacturing sarin and VX nerve gas, which they used in their subsequent attacks. In 1994, the group used a converted refrigerator truck to release the gas on a neighborhood where judges, who were presiding over a lawsuit against the group, lived. 500 people were injured and 8 died, but the attack was not linked to the cult at the time. A few months later, the brother of a member who had escaped was kidnapped, dispatched by the group, and disposed of with a microwave-powered incinerator. He had left a note saying that should he go missing, the group was responsible. Asahara was trying to manufacture weapons, and in order to distract the police, had some of his followers carry out a devastating attack. On March 20th, 1995, OM members boarded 5 separate trains in Tokyo's subway system and released sarin gas, resulting in 13 people dying, 54 being seriously injured, and between 980 and 6,000 people being hurt. This distraction backfired, and the police raided the group's base at the foot of Mount Fuji and discovered explosives, weapons, biological warfare agents, and even a Russian military helicopter. Over 150 cult members were arrested. The next month, a burning paper bag containing a hydrogen cyanide device was found and defused. Had it not been found in time, over 10,000 people could have died. Several other similar devices were found in the days following, and more disasters were averted. Asahara was eventually eventually arrested as his cult continued to attack people connected with the investigation, sending bombs in the mail to the governor, resulting in his secretary's fingers being blown off. In October of 1995, the group was stripped of its religious status and went bankrupt, but it managed to rebrand and still operates in a limited capacity to this day. Azahara and the 12 other cult members who had been found responsible for the attacks were arrested and held until their executions in 2018. Number 3. Heaven's Gate. Not to be confused with the 1980 Western that flopped so hard that the director-driven film era in Hollywood was brought to an end, Heaven's Gate was an American religious movement founded in 1974 by Bonnie Nettles and Marshall Applewhite, otherwise known as T and Doe. T met Doe while working at a hospital in 1972 when Doe was visiting a sick friend. Doe was really into biblical prophecy, and upon meeting the woman, felt that she was so familiar that they must have met in a past life. On the other hand, she claimed that aliens had told her that they would one day meet and that they had a divine mission to accomplish. You know, just like the Blues Brothers. The two studied religious and science fiction texts together, eventually coming to the logical conclusion that Doe was a reincarnated Jesus and that they had been chosen to fulfill the prophecies of the Bible, and that they had been given higher level minds than most folks, and were the two witnesses described in the book of Revelations. They were pretty sure that they would die and be resurrected, at which point a UFO would show up and take them away. They had trouble getting followers until they began advertising meetings where they claimed that aliens wanted volunteers for an experiment, which would result in the subjects being brought to a higher evolutionary level. They recruited over 100 members who they traveled the country with before becoming reclusive. Bonnie Nettles, aka T, died of liver cancer in 1985, and Marshall Applewhite, aka Doe, became the sole leader of the group. In 1996, the group rented a home in Rancho Santa Fe in California, which they referred to as the Monastery. In 1997, Doe made a video message claiming that they had to evacuate Earth by taking their own lives as Heaven's Gate was closing, and by dying, they would be taken by a UFO to a higher level of existence. Doe and 38 other cult members then dressed in identical black shirts with armbands that read Heaven's Gate Away Team, as an extremely macabre Star Trek reference. All of them were also wearing Nike Decades, as the group apparently had adopted the company's slogan of "Just Do It" as a personal slogan. The group then covered their heads with plastic bags and asphyxiated. They did this in 3 tiers so that the remaining members could take off their bags and arrange their bodies with dignity. In an interesting bit of trivia, in the aftermath of this incident, the Nike Decades have become a highly sought-after collector's item due to their involvement in the incident, because of course they are. Number 2. The People's Temple Agricultural Project. Founded by Jim Jones in Indiana in 1955, the People's Temple preached that those who remained drugged with the opiate of religion had to be brought to enlightenment with socialism. Of course, this wasn't the fun Bernie Sanders socialism where everyone gets to go to college. Jordan's main influences were people like Chairman Mao and Joseph Stalin. He was driven out of Indiana due to having integrationist beliefs and went to California, where he became involved in local politics, helping George Moscone become mayor of San Francisco in 1975. As a result, Jones was made the chairman of the city's Housing Authority Commission, which allowed him to rub elbows with the wealthy and powerful. After some backlash from local newspapers and fears of a police crackdown, the group set up a commune in Guyana, which was a small and poor enough and independent enough country that Jones thought he would be able to easily get political influence and protection. With the approval of the local government, the group began building their commune, which they called Jonestown. He made a deal with the government that would allow hundreds of cult members to enter the country, but very difficult for them to leave. At its peak, Jonestown had about 900 people living in the small commune. Jones became more and more unhinged, controlling the media the group were allowed to consume, lest they be subjected to a movie that wasn't pro-Marxist. He made everyone in the commune work long shifts, 6 days a week. He continued to brainwash and manipulate his people, telling them that they would soon be under attack by the CIA and should prepare to eventually take their own lives as a form of revolutionary protest, and had them guard the entrances of Jonestown with machine guns and machetes. As concerns from family members in the states grew, investigations into Jonestown began. When a delegation of investigators, reporters, and concerned relatives went to visit the commune, they were able to convince a few members to defect. As they tried to return to the states on 2 planes, one of the defectors produced a handgun and began opening fire on the other passengers. At the same time, a tractor trailer stormed the airstrip, with the passengers of the trailer producing shotguns and firing at the planes, with none on board surviving. While this was happening, Jones had a cocktail of poisons mixed into a large tub of grape Flavor-Aid, and had the 909 residents drink it and take their own lives. Despite the fact that it was Flavor-Aid that was used by Jones, the incident was the source of the expression, "drink the Kool-Aid." Number 1. The Thuggy Cult. The Thuggy were a secret society operating in India in the mid-1800s who were known for attacking travelers and garroting them with a weapon called a rumal. Its members were trained from childhood in its use. They considered efficient and quiet acts of murder to be the greatest accomplishment possible. They would follow groups of travelers until they made camp, at which point they would attack. Word of the Thuggy began to grow as numerous bodies began to be discovered in wells around the countryside. However, the Thuggy were not attacking their victims simply to take their valuables. The number one rule of the cult was not to shed any of their victims' blood, as they were actually human sacrifices for their god, Kali. The Thuggy believed that constant indulgence in vices was the only way to become closer to and achieve union with their god. During the time that the cult was active, over 30,000 people were attacked by the Thuggy and sacrificed to Kali. British officers were tasked with eliminating the cult and began mapping out the cult's attacks in order to predict where the attacks would likely take place and set traps for the Thuggy while disguised as merchants and travelers. Between 1830 and 1841, at least 3,700 cult members were captured, effectively ending the group. Many were put in prison for the rest of their lives, with 500 of them being hanged. Without exception, all of them that went to the gallows showed no emotion or remorse, often requesting to put on their own nooses themselves. When asked if he was sorry, one member who claimed to have the Thuggy record for most victims at 931 responded that no one should ever feel bad for following their trade. The term thug is still used to this day to describe a brutal criminal, and the group is remembered for their various appearances as villains in films over the years, such as when they were depicted by Steven Spielberg in Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom.
Number 5 on this list is the Catholic persecution in Britain. This happened in the 16th and 17th century and was really not a good time to be alive if you were Catholic. The list first says, Britain has been trying to rebrand its historical image with tea and monocles, though it's hard to do given how violent its history has been. We're not even talking about the colonies here. A civilian in Old Britain may die in a variety of ways depending on the time period. The worst, however, would have probably been during the Catholic Rebellion and their eventual persecution. It was generally a time of upheaval in Europe, largely over the question of which kind of Christianity is the best one. The situation was especially bad in England as the ruling Protestants really did not like the Catholic population. If you were suspected of being a Catholic or harboring one, there were a number of creatively horrifying ways you could die. One woman was slowly and publicly crushed to death simply for refusing to talk when she was questioned for supporting the Catholics. You could be drawn and quartered, hung, or just lynched by a mob. The mob thing was rare as the central authorities made sure to intervene and kill you themselves before the situation got so out of hands. How nice of them. Yeah, so just a casual death by public crushing for maybe supporting Catholicism. This is a time in history that I feel doesn't get brought up nearly enough based on what happened. In all honesty, I didn't even really know about this time until I started doing some research for this video. Maybe that is because the British government has tried to do a full rebrand and doesn't really want to bring up the dark past of what was once one of the worst times to be alive. Throughout history, people have consistently been persecuted for their beliefs and how they want to live their lives. This was one of the worst examples of that in history, and it's definitely not a time that you would have wanted to be alive. Number 4 on this list is the Siege of Sarajevo. This time really isn't that far off from us at all, folks. This siege took place from 1992 to 1996. Sarajevo is the capital of Bosnia, and had you have lived in this place during that time, life would have been hell. List first says, sieges are an overall bad time to be in, and we highly recommend not being in one if it could be helped. Some of the most prolonged sieges in history, like the Siege of Leningrad, have been huge humanitarian disasters too, as sieges primarily affect the citizens. One particularly horrifying siege that isn't mentioned that often is the Siege of Sarajevo by the Serbs, which is also the longest siege of a capital city in modern history. It went on for almost 4 years, and close to 14,000 people ended up dying. If the incessant shelling on primarily civilian areas like the market didn't get you, you could die in many other ways. People were dying just from the harsh cold as there were no fuel supplies in many parts of the city. Quite a few of them had to move into shared spaces with other families without any amenities, turning an otherwise functioning city into a giant refugee camp. Many people were killed by snipers who deliberately targeted civilians. Think about being a citizen in that city during that time. Your entire life is literally just about surviving at that point. And not just for a week or for a month, for literally 4 years. 4 4 years of constant attack and horrible conditions to live in. 4 years of fearing that you and your family are gonna be killed. 4 years of freezing and having no good food to eat at all. And this literally happened not that long ago, guys. This just as easily could have been one of us that was caught living there. You were just in the wrong place in the wrong time, and now your life is uprooted and you need to fight to stay alive. Number 3 on this list is the Sengoku period. This was a period that took place in Japan from about 1467 to 1600. This verse says, the Sengoku period, lasting over 100 years, was one of the most defining parts of Japanese history, as well as one of the most influential. A lot of historical Japanese pop culture is set in that period, as it was a time of consistent war and rapidly shifting political climate. There were more warlords fighting for territory than you could count, as the central power of the shogun had weakened in recent times. For someone living in that period, war and suffering would have been part of your daily life. Apart from opposing factions regularly raiding villages and towns for supplies, civilians were often caught between battles they had nothing to do with. Of course, that wasn't the case in every village across Japan, as many of them thrived due to the shifting landscape too. For those caught between the battles or just lost in the vast swaths of ungoverned Japanese territory though, it was a dangerous time to be in. The period was noteworthy for its brutality and general disregard for human life, and gave way to some of the most fearsome samurai warriors in Japanese history. There are a few documentaries on this time period of Japan, and they are all very informative and super interesting. It's pretty neat to look back now and see what was going on, but back then, having to live through it, that would have been horrible. It really was like a massive game of Risk that everyone was playing. And even if you were just a farmer trying to survive, it didn't matter. You were now caught up in this massive game of Risk, and your life was constantly on the line. Number 2 on this list is the Roman Empire. Okay, wait, I thought the Roman Empire was supposed to be one of the greatest empires ever. Well, it was. And if you were one of the leaders or a member of the elite class during this time, then you were laughing. But for some, it wasn't as nice. Specifically, the miners. The Roman Empire had a lot of slaves, mostly people that were taken from conquered territories and forced to work for the Romans. The worst possible place that you could be sent, though, was the mines. If you were a slave and you got sent to the Roman Empire mines, then life, it's about to get horribly bad. The conditions were awful down there. Mining was relatively new back then, and there wasn't really any advanced technology to help these people. Not that they would have received any help anyways, though. The Romans were brutal to these people, and specifically handpicked people they didn't like to be sent down there. Disease was widespread because people were literally worked to death and never cleaned. They were given very little food, and if they weren't producing quick enough, then they would just be killed. And oftentimes, these killings were of amusement to the guards as well, and they would mutilate you or throw you in a pit with a hungry wild animal. There were literally no redeeming qualities to the mines at all, and you probably wished for death if you got sent there. And finally, number 1 on this list is the year 536. Kind of a specific year here, folks, but from what I've heard, it was literally the worst. This verse says, when us laymen talk about the worst times in history, we're thinking of stuff like violence and proximity to cannibalism. We don't have any scientific parameters to measure how bad a time is for the people living in it, though we can make educated guesses. When it comes to actual scientists, though, they don't bother with guesses or estimates, and have calculated the exact year it was the worst time to be alive in history, the year 536. Apart from the falling empires the world over and general political chaos, the year 536 also marked one of the worst global famines in human history. The famine was due to ash in the air blocking the sunlight, which isn't surprising as there were also quite a few humongous volcanic eruptions around that time for good measure. The foggy eclipse of the sun, as it was described then, was visible everywhere in the world, giving the whole thing an even creepier vibe. Combine that with brutal conflicts in many places around the world, and you know why the researchers chose the year 536 to be the absolute worst one in history. So basically, year 536 was just hell on earth. Everyone was either dying or fighting, or they were dying of not having any food at all. It's kind of crazy to think that only a few thousand 1,000 years ago, this could have been us. Nowadays, farming is so advanced that most of us are in a pretty good place when it comes to food, but back then, if the river dried up or the sun didn't come out, that was it, guys. We just aren't gonna be eating anymore. Just be thankful that the year is 2022 right now and not 536. Number 5 on this list is the dancing plague of 1518. That's right, guys, you heard that right. A plague about dancing. Honestly, I'd never heard of this before, and in my whole time working on this channel, this is actually the coolest and strangest thing that I've ever come across. So in Strasbourg, Alsace, which is now modern day France, in the year 1518, from July all the way to September, people just started dancing. For months, hundreds of people were dancing in the streets of France, and they couldn't stop. It's said that one woman started dancing in the streets one day, and then some more came, and they just kept going for months with absolutely no reason at all. People started thinking that this was the cause of a demonic possession or some ghost that was making people lose their minds, but in actuality, nobody had any idea why these people were doing this. This wasn't a casual waltz either. These people were going hard. These people went so hard that they literally danced themselves to death. I can't possibly imagine going so hard at the club that I died, but that's basically what happened here with these people. There are actual claims that at one point in the heat of all this dancing, up to 15 people were dying per day just from dancing. This death kept happening, and these people would continue dancing around all of these bodies. This plague went on until September, when it just suddenly subsided, and that was that. No explanation, no reasoning behind it. They just went hard for several months and then stopped. That's why everyone thinks that something demonic has to be the cause of all this. Some people have speculated that food poisoning may have played some role, but that just doesn't make any sense to me because it went on for months. Seriously, folks, please comment down below what you think about this or some theories about why this happened, because it has me pretty baffled. Number 4 on this list is the lost city of Atlantis. Atlantis is a city that is considered to be a utopian society in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. It was first documented by Plato in 2 of his works, Timaeus and Critias. Now, even though Atlantis is often referred to as a city these days, back then Plato described it as an island. This island was located in the Atlantic and was said to be pretty massive, bigger than Asia Minor and Libya combined. This island, or city, was extremely wealthy and had a surplus of resources. This is what led them to being considered a utopia and a highly advanced group. Now, Plato describes a great battle between these Atlanteans and the Athenians, and says that after lots of hard fighting, the Athenians eventually prevailed in the war. Then, several massive earthquakes caused the earth to shift, and the entire island of Atlantis was swallowed up by the sea, and now rests at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean somewhere. Many people have speculated on how accurate these tales from Plato are, with experts believing that this could just all be a myth. However, the legend of Atlantis started to circulate around Europe many years later, and people began searching for this lost city. Nobody has found it to this day, but that doesn't mean that it never existed. Maybe we're just thinking about it the wrong way. Some people have thought that this entire city of Atlantis could have been aliens coming down to Earth, and that potentially this island was never really an island to begin with. Plato does describe the society as being a utopia, and an explanation for that would be aliens that have far better technology than we do. Maybe when this island apparently disappeared, these aliens just left. Now, that does beg the question, if they're so advanced, how on earth could the ancient Athenians beat them in a battle? Which I do think is a very fair point. I do believe that Plato and the people after him have exaggerated this story, and the full truth has probably been lost in history. But I also believe that this tale didn't just come out of nowhere, and something potentially paranormal could be at hand. Number 3 on this list is the Coral Castle. The Coral Castle is a limestone structure located in Florida. It is super unique and has these strange limestone rocks that have been carved into various figures. Now, there's nothing inherently cursed about this place. However, similar to the pyramids or Stonehenge that we covered in our last video, people wonder how on earth this place was made. Edward Leeds Scallon was a self-taught Russian engineer who came to America. He lived from 1887 to 1951 and is credited with being the creator of the Coral Castle. What's absolutely crazy about this story, though, is he constructed the structure all by himself. This is what baffles people to this day. How on earth is it possible that one man in the early 1900s was capable of moving these limestones and carving them the way that they are single-handedly? These stones weigh thousands of pounds, and there's no way that a man would ever be able to lift these things with sheer strength. Now, he was an engineer, and people have speculated that it was potentially the use of magnetism, something that he was fascinated with in his life. When asked how he was able to do this, he replied, "I understand the laws of weight and leverage, and I know the secrets of the people who built the pyramids." This kind of makes sense, but with the pyramids, they had thousands of people working on them all at once. You were only one man. People have theorized that Edward actually had some supernatural abilities that he was hiding from the public. This could honestly be believable because his personality was apparently extremely eccentric and very strange. However Edward was able to construct the Coral Castle, it truly is remarkable. Number 2 on this list is the oldest ghost story of all time. Ever wonder when all this started? When did humans start believing in ghosts, or when did we have our first encounter with a poltergeist? Well, a 3,500-year-old tablet may have the earliest depiction of a ghost as we know them today. This is a small tablet that was made in ancient Babylon and is considered by some experts to be one of the first, if not the first, written depiction of a ghost. The ghostly drawings could be easily missed, and you have to really pay attention if you're going to see it. An expert on the subject, Irvin Finkel, says, "You'd probably never give it a second thought because the area where the drawings are looks like it's got no writing. But when you examine it and hold it under a lamp, those figures leap out at you across time in the most startling way." The tablet goes into detail on how to get rid of ghosts and calls for an exorcist. It explains how this exorcist must make figurines of a man and a woman, and also speak the words of Mesopotamian god Shemesh to get rid of the ghost. There's also a warning to the reader to not turn around, potentially an indicator that a ghost could be behind you, or you could risk getting sucked into the underworld if your focus isn't steady. This tablet also lists a bunch of materials that can be used in rituals and that can be used to prevent ghosts from appearing in the first place. This is super interesting because it means that ghosts and spirits visiting the living can be traced all the way back to the ancient Mesopotamians. We were having paranormal events happen to us thousands of years ago, and the action of exorcising demons and ghosts, it all started with these guys. One could argue that they were the founders and innovators of a lot of our ghostly practices and knowledge to this day. Number 1 on this list is Oak Island. Oak Island is a very mysterious island that has been shrouded in lore for years. It's a privately owned island off the south shore of Nova Scotia, Canada. It has so many rumors surrounding it that it's even got its own television show called The Curse of Oak Island that has 8 seasons under its belt. This is a reality television show by the History Channel where they explore the mysteries of Oak Island, and considering they're on season 8, it's fair to say that there have been quite a few mysteries. The one that's gained the most international fame, though, is the Money Pit. The Money Pit is supposedly a place on Oak Island where there's a plethora of buried treasure waiting for somebody to dig it up. This treasure was left by the pirate Captain William Kidd, who lived from 1645 to 1701. There's said to be vast riches here, however no one's been able to find it up until this point. This is largely because finding buried treasure can be extremely difficult, but also due to the curse that surrounds it. The curse that hovers over this treasure states that 7 men will die in search of the treasure before it's found. To this day, there have actually been 6 deaths associated with this buried treasure. That means that if one more person was to die whilst they're looking for it, then the treasure would either reveal itself, or the next person who goes looking for it would be the one who finds it. Problem with this is that there's one more person who needs to die, and I don't think that anyone wants to be that unlucky number 7. Other than this pirate treasure, there's also rumored to be some extremely valuable and mystical items here. Never before seen Shakespearean plays, the Holy Grail, and the Ark of the Covenant have all been linked to Oak Island. If searching for cursed treasure is your cup of tea, and this is definitely the place for you.
Kicking off at number 5, the Fon Delta Necropolis. Now, Greece, of course, is the land of one of this planet's longest standing ancient civilizations, and dig sites are a dime a dozen across both the rural and metropolitan areas of the country, slowly uncovering the mysteries of a long-lost Greek society. While in early 2016, researchers discovered one terrifyingly unique manner of burial and mass execution. Apparently because, well, they're not entirely sure. Found in a large ancient cemetery in part of the Fon Delta Necropolis in Athens were at least 80 skeletons in a line stacked on top of each other with their wrists clamped together in a chain of iron shackles. The strangest thing was, though, that all of these men were incredibly young and in a very good state of health, indicating that they weren't slaves or common criminals, and the orderly, uniform way that they were buried seemed to support this. Whatever happened was an incredibly violent act, with their hands bound above their heads before being uniformly executed. The whole thing doesn't really make any sense sense at all, but the leading theory is that all of these young men were part of an attempted coup during a period of great unrest for Athenian society. The coup failed, of course, but the fact that these men were all buried in a respectful manner despite the violent circumstances that they were executed in leaves far more perplexing questions than it does answers. Swinging in at number 4, the Persian Siege. Now, in the ancient world, sieges and bloody battles were the only real way to get things done, but during an age where the most cutting-edge technology was a composite ballista, it was pretty shocking when archaeologists discovered some startling evidence of chemical warfare. In 256 AD, well, turns out that over 2,000 years ago, 19 Roman soldiers rushed into a cramped underground tunnel as they prepared to defend the Roman-held Syrian city of Dropa Stones from an army of Persian soldiers digging beneath the city's mud brick walls. Instead of meeting a horde of Persian besiegers, though, they were met by one soldier, and then a wall of noxious black smoke turned their lungs into acid. They all died in excruciating pain, sealed for eternity beneath the earth. But flash forward to the 1920s, though, and French archaeologist Robert Dumensil began excavating the Roman site that backed up against the Euphrates River. That's when he found the piled up skeletal remains of the 19 Roman soldiers and one lone Persian at the other end of the tunnel. Initially, he thought that the Persian soldier had somehow managed to defeat 19 highly trained legionnaires in close quarters combat, but that's when he noticed crystals of sulfur and bitumen scattered across the tunnel walls. Turned out the Persian force had developed an experimental tar-like petrochemical that burnt fast and hot and killed with deadly efficiency. Also turns out that chemical warfare was much more common than we expected in the ancient world. What a way to go, eh? Next up at number 3, the mystery of Herxheim. And this one is pretty damn terrifying, really. Sometime in 5300 BC, which is a long time ago, what is known as a linear pottery culture developed in the southwest region of Herxheim in Germany, one that for all intents and purposes could be described as an idyllic, peaceful Stone Age settlement. Safe from invaders and predators, the village thrived with its rudimentary agriculture and societal development. That is until sometime around 4950 BC, when the settlement in Herxheim abruptly and without warning disappeared. But they didn't exactly disappear. Instead, they were ritualistically butchered, smashed to pieces, and buried beneath the same dirt that they once called home. Turns out in 2009, an archaeological dig site unearthed human remains of over 1,000 ancient villagers. The bones were of men, women, children, even infants and fetuses. Stranger still, though, tool markings on all of the bones showed that the flesh had been carefully scraped off, while larger bones had been broken, possibly to get at the marrow inside. Hell, even the skulls were cracked open in an effort to extract their brains. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing and were incredibly proficient at butchering the human anatomy, presumably to eat, as there was no sign of the removed flesh in the surrounding area. It gets weirder though, because after extracting DNA from their remains, it turned out that these people came from all over Europe in roughly a 500-mile radius. In fact, the leading theory is that all of these people volunteered to come to Herxheim on their own free will to be ritualistically sacrificed and then seemingly eaten. Yeah. Coming in at number 2, the Tomb of the Sunken Skulls. Talking of ritualistic burial sites, there's an even older one, and it's even weirder, actually. Sometime in 2009, archaeologists found what they believe to be a Stone Age settlement near what was once a shallow lake in Motala, a town in southwest Sweden. The routine dig took a strange turn, though, when researchers discovered the skulls and skull fragments from 11 individuals, including men, women, children, and infants. In fact, the site, which would later be known as Canal Jordan, turned out to be nearly 8,000 years old. But we also have to remember that Canal Jordan was a lake, and the remains were found stacked inside a large stone mass grave with a giant heavy lid built on the bottom of a body of water. Hey, it gets weirder though, guys, because 2 of the human skulls found were pierced with wooden stakes, with the majority of the others showing signs of also being penetrated by sharp objects. It seemed to point toward using their heads as some sort of bizarre trophy or totem, but also it poses the question, why would you then bury them underneath a lake in a stone tomb with children? But hey, again, it gets even weirder, because one of the female skulls found there was actually filled with fragments of bone from all of the other skulls in the tomb, like some weird kind of horrifying potpourri. The leading theory is that Canal Jordan likely served as a sacred meeting spot for several nomadic bands of Mesolithic Swedes roaming the forest and shores of Sweden over 8,000 years ago. For some reason though, they felt compelled to bury people's heads in a stone tomb at the bottom of a lake, and no one really knows why. My best guess though, vampires. or aliens, alien vampires. And finally, coming in at our number one spot, the Claddagh Mummies. If you know anything about bog bodies, you'll know that they're already terrifying enough. The British Isles are relatively unique in the sense that they're littered with geographical peat bogs, a unique high-acid, low-oxygen environment which inhibits specific bacteria that break down organics. Because of that, they're also perfect for preserving bodies, and history has shown numerous instances of discovering ancient bodies hidden away in the deep peat bogs of Scotland, Ireland, England, and Wales. Well, usually they're just incredibly well-preserved, mummified perfectly for archaeological purposes, but back in early 2012, scientists discovered two 3,000-year-old Scottish bog bodies, remnants of the 11th century ancestral houses of Claddagh, a prehistoric village on the Isle of South Uist. But hold on, because if that timeline isn't already peculiar enough, it gets weirder. Because first and foremost, researchers discovered that these two corpses had been buried between 300 and 600 years after their death. Hold on though, because it does get weirder, because these corpses quickly had scientists scratching their heads because their bones just didn't match up, although they showed clear signs of being articulated as one whole cadaver. Turned out after DNA testing each of their limbs, they were from completely separate people, all of which had died at different points in ancient history. It's what's called a composite mummy, and no one has any idea what the hell it was or still is, but for some reason an ancient society was collecting body parts and sticking them all together in some horrifying Frankensteinian manner. Yeah, let that one sink in, just like a peat bog body.
Number 5 on this list is the pyramids. The Great Pyramids are located in Egypt and are some of the oldest structures on the entire planet. The pyramids are said to have been constructed over 4,500 years ago and were made to act as the burial grounds for the pharaohs of Egypt. The Great Pyramid, which is the biggest of all of them, is over 450 feet tall with a base of over 750 feet wide. That's a really big structure and acted as the largest structure on Earth for almost 4,000 years. It should also be noted that the pyramids are made up of massive stone blocks. For the Great Pyramid, it's estimated that 2.3 million stone blocks are what keep it standing to this day. Every block of the Great Pyramid also weighs approximately 2.5 to 15 tons. Just a reminder that a ton is 2,000 pounds, so there were some blocks that could have weighed close to 30,000 pounds. All of this is completely unbelievable. So unbelievable, in fact, that people think something else might have been at play in making them. It's currently believed that these were made by humans. It took thousands of humans to construct, but when you think about how monstrous these creations are and the technology that humans had back in that day, it becomes very hard to believe that we were capable of doing that. This has led people to the theory of aliens. These pyramids are also built to face the precise magnetic north, which makes people wonder how the ancient Egyptians could have possibly got that information. The theory is that these aliens came down and built the pyramids and the ancient Egyptians mistook them for gods. This is why in some ancient Egyptian drawings we see gods flying around. The Daily Star also reports the speed of light is 299,792,458 meters per second, and the geographic coordinates for the Great Pyramid coincide with that if you just move the decimal points over several spaces. They believe that this was a clue from the aliens for us to discover later. Frankly, as cool as aliens are, I would honestly rather believe that humans made the pyramids. It's pretty cool to know that almost 5,000 years ago, our species was able to make something like that. I feel like I have a little bit of pride for those ancient Egyptians. Number 4 on this list is the Bermuda Triangle. You've obviously heard about the Bermuda Triangle before and the lore that accompanies this extremely mysterious place. If you don't know what it is though, then the History Channel classifies it as a mythical section of the Atlantic Ocean roughly bounded by Miami, Bermuda, and Puerto Rico, where dozens of ships and airplanes have disappeared. These disappearances have continued to this day, but started hundreds of years ago. Basically, since people started crossing over the Atlantic Ocean and records of ships were being kept. In fact, it's believed that William Shakespeare's The Tempest was based on a real shipwreck that happened at the Bermuda Triangle. So legends of this place can at least be dated back to when he wrote that play, which was in the early 1600s. In 1918, the legend of the Bermuda Triangle reached an all-time high when the USS Cyclops, a massive ship from the United States, sank to the bottom of the ocean. This ship was over 500 feet long and had over 300 people on board. It was a horrible catastrophe when it happened. What made this even more stupefying was that the ship had the capability ability to send out a distress signal and didn't do so, making everyone wonder what on earth happened. What has caused all these shipwrecks and plane crashes over the years is still unknown, but there are some theories. Some people believe that the Bermuda Triangle is home to a massive sea monster, potentially the Kraken or something like that. A massive tentacled monster with the ability to drag a ship down to the depths of the ocean and eat all who are on board. Some people believe that there may even be a wormhole that is out there in the middle of the ocean. A wormhole is a ripple through space-time which experts believe would act as a portal to another time and dimension. The Bermuda Triangle has also been called the Devil's Triangle before, indicating that some people believe this place could be the work of the devil or some strong sea demons out there. Nobody really knows the true cause of the Bermuda Triangle, and considering it's been talked about for hundreds of years, we may never know. Number 3 on this list is Stonehenge. Stonehenge is very similar to the pyramids, having been built roughly 5,000 years ago and being so difficult to construct that people think some sort of paranormal events must have transpired. Located in Wiltshire, England, Stonehenge is a monument that features massive stones standing vertically that weigh roughly 25 tons. That's 50,000 pounds of weight that these monstrous stones have to them. The monument is oriented towards the sunrise on the summer solstice, but other than that, not a lot of people know why it's there or what its purpose was. Now it is owned by the Crown and considered a heritage site, but still people wonder, why was it put there in the first place? Some theories involve its effect on sound waves. When two people are playing a pipe and you walk around the stones, then you'll notice an effect where they cancel each other out. Some people have even chalked it up as being an ancient sex symbol, believe it or not. However, the most popular theory is similar to the pyramids in believing that it's aliens. I tend to believe aliens were capable of this more than the periods, to be honest. They are certainly arranged in a strange fashion and they have no set purpose. How is it possible for humans to lug stones that are 50,000 pounds to a location where there aren't that many stones to begin with? Stonehenge just screams like the sort of place where something paranormal happened, in my opinion. Number 2 on this list is Jesus. I feel like this wouldn't be a complete list if I didn't include one of the most mysterious events that occurred in all of history. Jesus lived 2,000 years ago during a tumultuous time. His life was one that we all remember and has inspired millions of people since he passed. His death is where something paranormal may have taken place though. Jesus died by crucifixion at the hands of the Romans. This was ordered by the governor Pilate, who felt the pressures from the Roman people and felt like he had to give in to them. The crucifixion process lasted for over 6 hours apparently, until Jesus finally gave his last breath. After he died, he was taken to his tomb, which was closed off and shut by a massive stone. This tomb was guarded by several officers for days, until on the 3rd day it said that the rock moved and Jesus ascended from that tomb to heaven. His body was no longer in the tomb on this day, and the belief that he went to heaven spread throughout the land. Now, a question a lot of people ask is, how do we know for sure that his body was gone and that tomb was actually empty? Now, we know that because after he was gone and his followers were claiming he was resurrected, then the best way for the Romans to stop that theory would have been to produce the body, which they were never capable of doing. So where did it go? Well, it's widely believed that Jesus ascended to heaven, that God acted and brought his son home to him. Maybe this event is less of a paranormal event and more of a miracle, but I still wanted to include it in this video. Number 1 on this list is the Dropa Stones. The legends of the Dropa Stones is a little bit up in the air, but if it is true, then there is certainly something paranormal afoot. The Dropa Stones are a collection of 716 circular discs that are said to be over 12,000 years old. They have very strange markings on them in a language that hardly anyone is familiar with. These stones were apparently discovered by Chupei Tay, a Chinese archaeologist in the 1930s who found them inside some abandoned caves. They made their way to a translator who was able to decipher some of the markings and learn that they were referring to humans and aliens. So the theory is that aliens were present 12,000 years ago and had some serious interactions with humans back then. Now, there are a few reasons why we can't take this as being full fact. 1, it's possible that the translator who was in charge of deciphering them is wrong. We can't say for sure that they're familiar with the intricacies of language 12,000 years ago. Number 2 is that today, nobody knows where these stones have gone. They aren't in a museum and their location is unknown. And this is really hard to believe considering there are 716 of them and they would have been one of the biggest archaeological finds in years. All of this being said though, if these stones are real and our translator was correct, then that is undeniable proof of an alien human presence from 12,000 years ago, which is pretty cool to think about.
Number 5. Robert Liston. I figured I'd start with Robert Liston since he's a bit of an outlier on this list, because unlike the other ones, I don't know if he was truly evil, but he just enjoyed life much differently than the rest of us. You see, Robert Liston was a Scottish surgeon in the 19th century who had a pretty notable reputation. He was the fastest blade in the West End. He boasted that no one could slice and dice faster than he could if the legends about him are to be believed. He was allegedly able to perform a full amputation of a limb in 3 minutes, only losing 1 out of every 10 patients, which honestly, all things considered, is actually a pretty impressive feat, if not an absolutely terrifying one to think about. Liston didn't really have bedside manner to speak of though, and he would take a glee in his work that kind of bordered on sadism. He wasn't a mad scientist plotting world domination, but he was a particularly odd fellow who really reveled in how good he was at removing people's limbs. Everybody's got a hobby, everybody's got something that makes them happy. One particularly grisly anecdote says he once severed a leg in under 30 seconds and gleefully laughed to his crowd of spectators, "Time me, boys!" So evil? I don't know, maybe not. Questionable? Absolutely. Would I hang out with this guy? Probably not while he was working. The issue with Liston is that while he definitely had speed, and no one could argue that, accuracy was not always his strongest suit. Frequently, his rush work would result in his patients having unnecessary complications and conditions such as dying. Perhaps unsurprisingly, Liston has the world's only surgery with a 300% mortality rate. In one occasion, he was working so quickly and carelessly that he amputated his assistant's own fingers off while attempting to sever a leg. And as he was doing this, he swung the knife backwards and ended up hitting a spectator who fainted out of shock. The patient, the assistant, and the spectator all died a few days later, leading to the only surgery that managed to lead to the death of 3 people. That's an impressive record, if nothing else. And my friends, if you'd like to hear more freaky stories, true crime, cryptid sightings, UFO conspiracies, and just about everything scary under the sun and above it, why don't you give Top 5 Scary a subscribe for the best scary content on the net, and keep on screaming. Alright, moving on. Number 4, Jose Delgado. Do you think you could control a bull? I definitely don't. But Jose Delgado believed he could. He was a controversial researcher who believed that the best way to get an animal to behave was not by training it or teaching it a trick and giving it a treat every time it does the trick right, but to implant a series of electrodes into an animal's brain to be able to manually control it with a series of electroshocks. To make a lot of very complicated neuroscience comically short in layman's terms, he was creating remote control monkeys. And do you kind of want one now? Because I kind of want one. Delgado signed on to Yale University sometime in the 1950s, where he set up his little shop in a lab tinkering with all sorts of fun electronic experiments and gizmos to research new methods of control. Oftentimes, it was literally the flip of a switch that would alter the mood of a creature. The thing is, as scary as what he did, the results he was getting were unbelievable, stuff straight out of sci-fi. He was able to train monkeys by stimulating the parts of their brain that would activate aggression, and he would teach them how to manipulate other monkeys that were threatening them by flipping the switches of their aggression. It's nuts. Did you watch Westworld? I know you probably watched the first season at least. I've seen the viewership numbers. You know how in that show they could use those little tablets to open up like a cowboy robot's personality and alter all those stats like aggression, romance, bravery, etc, etc. Well, that's kind of what Delgado was doing, only on chimps instead of Evan Rachel Wood. One controversial experiment involved generating a painful sensation in a chimp's brain every time it produced a particular brain signal, which eventually led to the chimp learning not to think like that. Woof. Delgado's most infamous trial though was the one I mentioned at the beginning, stopping a bull in its tracks. He stood in front of a bull and, like the matadors of legend, stared it down and used a shortwave radio and a series of electrodes to freeze it in place. Johnny Knoxville would have loved that. Now, despite the controversial nature of his work, which inspired quite a good amount of debate and discussion about ethics, Delgado maintained up until his dying day that the work he was doing was for the benefit of mankind. He wasn't trying to develop mind control control, nor did he see his experiments as a way to influence people, but rather he saw his work as a way to overcome mental illness eventually, and cure brain disorders, and also probably save the lives of a lot of bullfighters. Number 3. Giovani Alini. So I don't want to spoil too much about this guy right away, but all I'll say is that Giovani Alini would end up being the source of inspiration for the character of Victor Frankenstein from Mary Shelley's famous sci-fi novel. So you can probably sort of guess what kind of things this guy was gonna get up to without even having to listen to the next 2 minutes, but I'm sure you're very curious, so I'll explain it to you in great detail anyway. As a young boy, Giovanni was fascinated by his uncle, who was also a physician, and would watch him perform strange experiments. His uncle had an interest in reanimating the dead to see if it was possible to restore vigor to an animal that had passed, and he primarily tested on frogs, where he would attach electrical currents to them. These events, unsurprisingly, would very profoundly affect Giovanni, who sought out to recreate what his uncle had started, only on a much, much bigger target. It's man if you couldn't figure that out by now. As he grew older, Giovanni followed in his uncle's footsteps, zapping frog corpses, moving up to trying to reanimate a bull's head, until ultimately earning his place in mad science history when he started to begin his trials on humans. He sourced his bodies from executed prisoners, thinking, hey, they're done with them, I might as well use them. Trouble was that Italy tended to prefer execution methods that involved the head and the body going in separate directions, although Giovanni made use of this as well. He discovered that with an electric current, he could make a patient's face contort, and this was on a head detached from a body. There's a terrifying mental image for you for the day. It was then, when he started sourcing prisoners' bodies from England, that he started to inch closer and closer to that goal of reanimation. He asked for a body as fresh as possible, and he got one George Foster, not the one who played for the Reds though. Attaching probes to this body, astoundingly, he got the man to open an eye, shake his jaw, and seemingly take a breath. This would end up being his last experiment, however, and he deemed the experiment a failure because the thing didn't sprung to life Frankenstein style. Chin up! I bet you'd love to know that your legacy was inspiring one of the most famous horror stories ever about a lunatic doctor who electrifies a corpse. Number 2. Albert Krigman. Now I feel like it bears mentioning before I even talk about all the twisted weird stuff that he did to earn his place in this list of evil scientists that Krigman just sounds like an evil scientist name, does it not? Like if you were writing a movie script, Krigman would be the stand-in name for your evil scientist before you could come up with a better one. Anyway, I digress. Dr. Albert Krigman was a dermatologist who was commissioned by Dow Jones and the US Army to research the effects of chemical compounds on human skin. Oh, yep, this is not going anywhere good. It goes without saying, but like he wasn't checking for Head and Shoulders 3-in-1 conditioner. Krigman was offered a modest lump sum of 10 grand in grant money to research, and he set up shop right away in Holmesburg Prison in Philadelphia, where he got a near endless supply of test subjects, or victims, to experiment on with very little regard for their safety or hygiene. It was documented that the experiments at Holmesburg Prison included hair transplants, implementation of foreign bodies, burns and radiation of the skin, exposure to dioxin, application and ingestion of toxic and near lethal doses of acne medicine, and the yanking of fingernails. Ugh. I completely understand if you need a moment to just kind of catch yourself. And editors, I'm so sorry for the pictures you guys are looking at for this video. You guys work hard. Alright, let's get back to talking about stomach-churning evil done in the name of science. One of the main compounds Krigman researched that I listed off in that little list before was dioxin, the main ingredient of Agent Orange, the infamously evil chemical weapon the USA used during the Vietnam War. Inmates would be scarred, left sick with permanently disfiguring skin conditions leading to very painful side effects. Oftentimes too, many subjects were exposed to all sorts of contaminants and other infections from other conditions he was doing, other experiments he was doing. He did not keep a clean workspace. Krigman destroyed many of the notes from his research, but through testaments from his victims, we know the truth of what he got up to. While there were attempts to get justice after the fact for what the inmates experienced, Krigman himself lived to the age of 93 and never faced any sort of consequences whatsoever for his actions. In fact, the worst part is Krigman loved what he did. Take a listen to this spine-chilling real quote from a real scientist who was really hired by the US Army. All I saw before me were acres of skin. It was like a farmer seeing a fertile field for the first time. That sounds like it's from one of the Saw movies. Are you kidding me? Okay, moving on. Somehow there's a guy who tops this. And finally, number 1, Sidney Gottlieb. Unlike the other scientists on this list, where I would offer a little bit of leeway onto whether or not you could truly consider them to be vile and evil outright, or just, a bit morally flexible in the name of progress, I actually feel very decent taking a stance and saying Sidney Gottlieb was pure evil. Gottlieb was an American chemist and spy master who helmed the CIA's infamous MK Ultra program. Surely, if you've watched even 2 videos featuring me, you have heard me yell like a lunatic about the MK Ultra program. The CIA's very real, very well documented, very traceable mind control program that they were very really researching in the 60s and 70s. And this lovely son of a gun was behind most of it. Gottlieb is about as close to the pop culture definition of an evil scientist as you can get. He believed that there was a way to influence the human mind to ensure global domination for the United States. At the height of the Cold War, the CIA believed that China and Russia had advancements in mind control technology and they needed to catch up. Gottlieb was commissioned to run a series of experiments. Initially, the goal was to develop a truth serum. Gottlieb would experiment with just about every single illegal illicit substance you could on humans, most of the time without them knowing what he was doing. He tested on volunteers, prisoners, homeless, but most often people had no idea the nature of his experiments, and he tended to pick people who had nothing left and had a lot to gain. After months and months of this left him unsatisfied, he was granted extra powers and resources for his experiments, gaining the full funding of the US Army. The goal of MK Ultra was to develop techniques that would crush the human psyche to the point that it would admit anything. Wow. This included torment like electroshock, sensory and sleep deprivation, all kinds of illicit substances, physical and mental damage, and so much more we can't even talk about. Eventually, the program was officially disbanded, citing that it was difficult to control the human psyche in this way. Godley would stick around, however, since he had a real taste for doing evil science, and would helm the CIA's Poison Research Division, looking into just about every way you could conceivably poison a human being, including one infamous poisoned cigar for one Fidel Castro. Gottlieb retired in relative obscurity, never seeing any justice for his work, and lived out his days quietly in Virginia, largely forgotten by history. Well, not by me. Sorry, if you're the real life inspiration for Papa on Stranger Things, you're gonna be the #1 evil scientist on this list.